January 1943. Guadalcanal. A single American light tank claws its way up a muddy jungle ridge engine, howling treads, shredding the earth. Its gun swings toward a wall of logs and packed dirt. It fires. The bunker erupts in smoke splinters and dead men. The tank grinds forward and fires again and again. One position at a time, a fortress that had frozen an entire army in its tracks is blown to pieces. The soldiers cheering behind that tank could not have told you the name of the general who ordered it done. Neither can you. He beat the Japanese on a jungle island in the South Pacific. Then he crossed to the other side of the planet and drove 250,000 men through France and into the Alps, all the way to the doorstep of Hitler's mountain retreat. He is the only American general who did both, and almost nobody alive today can say his name. If you love these forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more history, more untold battles, and more moments of courage from the past. His name was Alexander Patch, and by the end of this, you will understand exactly why the man with the strangest command record of the entire war became one of the most forgotten generals America ever produced. To understand what Patch walked into, you have to go back to the summer of 1942, to the worst months of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal. A stinking malarial island most Americans had never heard of and could not have found on a map. But it had an airfield, and whoever held that airfield controlled the sea lanes to Australia. So in August 1942, the Marines landed and seized it. And then the nightmare began. For months, the campaign hung by a single thread. The Japanese Navy came at night and hammered the island with battleship guns. American ships went to the bottom in such numbers that the water offshore earned a grim nickname that survives to this day, Iron Bottom Sound. The Marines ashore were bombed, shelled, and left short of food and medicine. They held on by pure stubbornness. Malaria killed as surely as bullets. Men shook with fever in their foxholes, while the enemy dug in on ridges the survivors would never forget. Mount Austin, the galloping horse, the seahorse, and here is the part the famous version leaves out. The Marines did not finish Guadalcanal. They could not. By late 1942, they were used up. Sick, starving, exhausted, hollowed out by 4 months of hell. The 1st Marine Division had bled itself nearly dry just holding the line. Somebody else had to come in. Somebody had to take command of everything on that island, every service, every unit, and actually win the thing. That is a specific and thankless kind of job. Closing out a brutal campaign wins no medals in the public memory. There are no dramatic landing photos, no bonsai charges repelled at the last second. Just grinding, patient, murderous work in the jungle, converting a desperate defense into a finished victory. It is the kind of job the Army handed to men it trusted and then forgot. And the man they chose was an anonymous 53-year-old infantry officer that almost no one in his own service had ever heard of. But everything was about to change because of a man nobody was paying attention to. So who was he? Alexander McCarroll. Patch was born on November 23, 1889, on a frontier cavalry post called Fort Huachuca, in what was then the Arizona Territory. Sit with that for a moment. He was born on an Indian Wars Army post before Arizona was even a state. His father was a West Point cavalry officer who had chased Apache across the desert until the frontier broke his health. So the boy grew up inside the Army before he ever joined it. He grew up around horses, around troopers, around the language of command. He went to West Point, and here is the detail that tells you everything. He graduated in 1913, ranked 75th in a class of 93. Near the bottom. He was a baseball player and a pole vaulter who scraped through the middle of the pack. He was exactly the kind of cadet the Army tends to overlook from the first day. And that in miniature is the whole story. The Army would keep overlooking him right up until the moment it needed someone who could actually win. He was quiet, religious, soft-spoken. He rolled his own cigarettes from a bag of Bull Durham tobacco and could talk to a private as easily as to a colonel. In the First World War, he ran the American Machine Gun School in France, teaching a Green Army how to use the weapon that had slaughtered a generation. Then he led an infantry battalion into the Meuse-Argonne from the front, and a staff officer named George Marshall noticed him. Marshall never forgot a competent man, but that same war marked Patch in a way that would eventually kill him. In the cold and damp of France, he caught a severe case of pneumonia. His lungs were never the same again. For the rest of his life, he would be fragile, vulnerable, shadowed by disease in every campaign he ever fought. The man who would conquer 2 theaters of war was physically a sick man. Remember that. And then a fateful assignment changed everything. In early 1942, Patch was sent to defend New Caledonia, a French island the United States desperately needed to keep the lifeline to Australia open. On the voyage out true to form, he came down with pneumonia. Again, he arrived sick. And then he did something nobody had ordered him to do. He took the scattered, mismatched units dumped on that island. Regiments from different states, men who had never trained together, a chaotic mess of leftovers. And he welded them into a single fighting division from nothing. They needed a name. A private suggested combining the words American and New Caledonian. And so was born one of the only American divisions in the entire war to carry a name instead of a number. The Americal Division. Patch built it with his own hands. Now think about the sheer strangeness of what came next. In December 1942, this obscure Army general was sent to Guadalcanal and told to take command of everything. Not just soldiers, Marines, naval aviation, a multi-service tangle of rival units on a malarial jungle island, all under one man that most of them had never heard of. In an army where the Marine Corps and the Army barely tolerated each other, where that rivalry would later explode into open warfare between commanders at Saipan, Patch was handed the most combustible command in the Pacific. And here is the thing that made people question him. He refused to fight the way glory-hungry commanders fought. On December 9, 1942, he officially relieved the legendary Marine General Vandegrift and took the island. On January 2, 1943, the Army handed him the 14th Corps. Now he commanded his own American Division, the 25th Infantry Division, and the 2nd Marine Division. More than 40,000 men facing fewer than 25,000 starving, disease-ridden Japanese who were cut off from all resupply. But do not mistake a weakened enemy for an easy fight. The Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal did not surrender. He dug in and died in place. And a commander in a hurry, a commander hunting headlines, would have thrown wave after wave of infantry straight into those guns and called the corpses the cost of doing business. That was not how Patch fought. And plenty of impatient men thought his caution looked like weakness. They had no idea it was about to save thousands of lives. Patch launched his Corps' offensive on January 10, 1943, and he fought it like the doctrine man he was. Methodically, with artillery, with coordination, with patience. Grinding through fortified ridgelines and suffocating jungle heat ridge by ridge, position by position, refusing to spend a single life he did not have to spend. The hardest nut on the whole island was a horseshoe of bunkers the Japanese had carved into the high ground near Mount Austin. A maze of mutually supporting log and earth strongpoints the Americans called the Gifu. Artillery bounced off it. Rifle fire did nothing. Men died crawling toward it. A general chasing a headline would have hurled his infantry at it head-on and drowned it in bodies. Patch did not. He sealed the position off. He reduced it deliberately, and he brought a single light tank grinding up that ridge to crack the bunkers one at a time. The way you saw at the very start of this story. The Gifu finally fell in the last week of January. That kind of patience never photographs well. It is invisible in the history books. But it is exactly why his casualty lists stayed shorter than they had any right to be. And the numbers prove it. In the January attacks, one of his hardest-hit regiments lost roughly 74 men killed and 226 wounded. Real losses, every one a human being. But compared to the slaughter the Marines had already endured, and compared to what frontal assaults cost everywhere else in the Pacific, Patch was spending his soldiers' lives like a man who counted every one. He was never cheap with the enemy, and never careless with his own. Then, in the first week of February 1943, the Japanese did something almost unheard of. They ran. Under cover of darkness, their destroyers slipped thousands of surviving men off the island, and Patch's forces closed the trap on empty foxholes. On February 9, 1943, Guadalcanal was declared secure. The first major ground offensive of the entire Pacific War was over, and it was an American victory. The meaning of that cannot be overstated. The Japanese army had been beaten on the ground for the first time in the war, and it never got the initiative back. Depending on how you count, the campaign cost the Japanese at least 19,000 dead, with thousands more lost to disease and starvation. An entire army destroyed. For pulling this off across a coalition of rival services, Patch received both the Army and the Navy Distinguished Service Medals. A rare double honor for a rare double achievement. But the jungle took its price from him too. By the time it was over, he was racked by pneumonia, malaria, and dysentery all at once. The fragile lungs from 1918 were failing him again. Marshall, who had never lost track of the quiet man from the Meuse Argonne, pulled him home in May 1943 to recover. And then, in classic Patch fashion, he vanished back into the machinery of the army, training divisions, running maneuvers with 100,000 men, doing the unglamorous work while other generals collected the magazine covers. He had just won the campaign that turned the tide of the Pacific War, and most of the country had no idea he existed. Here is where his story could easily have ended. A solid Pacific record, a corps command, a quiet path to retirement, and a comfortable obscurity. He was 53 years old, physically wrecked, and utterly unknown to the public he served. Any reasonable man would have called it a career. But the army was not finished with Alexander Patch. Not by a long shot. Because on the other side of the planet, an operation was being planned that the British Prime Minister himself thought was a catastrophic mistake. One of the largest amphibious invasions of the entire war. An assault that would put nearly 100,000 men on a hostile shore in a single day. And the army needed a commander who could take a mess of rival units, hold his nerve, and win without wasting lives. They needed the exact man who had just done it on Guadalcanal. So they took the quiet infantry officer. Nobody remembered the man ranked near the bottom of his West Point class, the man with the ruined lungs and the bag of Bull Durham tobacco, and they handed him an entire field army. They pointed him at the coast of southern France, and they told him to tear open the underbelly of Hitler's Europe. Would the same patient, self-effacing man who had ground his way across a jungle island be able to command 250,000 men across a continent? Could a general who refused to promote himself, who served under a boss, the supreme commander personally distrusted, survive the politics of the European High Command long enough to matter? And what would it cost him, this fragile man, to carry an army through the worst winter of the war, while a private tragedy waited for him in the frozen hills of Alsace? In Part 2, we will follow Alexander Patch onto the beaches of the French Riviera, into the most efficient amphibious landing of the entire war, and up the Rhone Valley in a pursuit that would bag more than 88,000 German prisoners. We will watch him force his way through mountains that no attacking army in recorded history had ever conquered. And we will stand beside him at a place called the Forest of Paroy on the day the war took from him the one thing no medal could ever replace. In Part 1, we followed a quiet, overlooked infantry officer named Alexander Patch. A man ranked near the bottom of his West Point class, a man with lungs ruined by pneumonia, a man nobody in his own army had heard of. And we watched him do the impossible. He took command of Marines, soldiers, and naval aviation on the malarial hell of Guadalcanal, and he ground out the first American ground victory of the entire Pacific War. Then the army handed him something bigger, an entire field army pointed at the coast of southern France. But commanding an invasion was one thing. Surviving the politics of the European High Command was another entirely. Because the operation Patch was about to lead had already been condemned as a strategic blunder, not by the Germans, but by the most powerful voice in the alliance. Winston Churchill himself fought against it almost to the final week. And the General Patch would answer to was a man the Supreme Commander of Allied forces personally distrusted. That single fact would follow Patch for the rest of his life, and beyond it, into the way history would choose to remember him. And this is where everything got worse. Understand what Patch inherited. Operation Anvil, later renamed Dragoon, was the planned invasion of the French Riviera, timed to open a second front in the south, while Normandy raged in the north. On paper, it was brilliant. It would trap the entire German Army Group G, seize the ports of Marseille and Toulon, and drive a dagger up the Rhone Valley into the soft belly of occupied France. But Churchill hated it. He wanted those divisions thrown into Italy or into the Balkans. Anywhere but a landing he considered a waste of men and ships. He argued so bitterly that he grumbled the very code name Dragoon had been chosen because he felt dragooned into it. So Patch took over an army whose central operation the British Prime Minister believed was a mistake. And he took it over from a man named Mark Clark, a general whose hunger for publicity was the exact opposite of Patch's temperament. Clark understood cameras. Clark understood reporters. Clark understood how a general's name gets carved into history. Patch understood none of that and wanted none of it. Where Clark's stage managed his own legend, Patch made himself invisible. In an army where reputation was hard currency, one man spent freely, and the other refused to spend it all. Above them both loomed the real obstacle. Not a general in the field, but the tangled web of politics at the top. Patch's 7th Army would soon come under a new headquarters, the 6th Army Group commanded by his old peacetime division commander, Jacob Devers. And here was the poison in the well. Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander himself, did not like Devers, did not trust him. Historians have documented this dislike thoroughly, and it was real, it was personal. And in a hierarchy, the feelings of the man at the top fall like a shadow across everyone beneath him. Devers was capable, energetic, aggressive. It did not matter. The distrust above him would dim the reputation of every officer serving under him, and the officer who deserved it least was Alexander Patch. Picture the pressure Patch was under before a single boot touched French sand. The clock was screaming. Every day of delay meant more German reinforcements, more prepared defenses, more Allied soldiers who would die on the beaches. Normandy had cost oceans of blood. The planners knew an opposed landing could turn a beach into a slaughterhouse in minutes. And Patch, the fragile man with the ruined lungs, carried the weight of nearly 100,000 lives that would go ashore on his word. If the landing failed, if the beachhead collapsed, the blame would land squarely on the quiet general. Nobody had wanted in the first place, and the doubters at headquarters would have their proof. But Patch had one thing the politics could not take from him. He had allies who had watched him work. The first was the man who had never forgotten him. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, the most powerful soldier in America. Marshall had noticed Patch back in 1918, leading a battalion from the front in the Meuse-Argonne. Marshall had tracked him through the wilderness, years through Guadalcanal, through the fevers and the disease. Marshall knew what most of the army did not, that this unglamorous, self-effacing man was one of the finest fighting commanders the country had. It was Marshall's confidence that put an army in Patch's hands. The second ally was a soldier's soldier named Lucien Truscott. Truscott would command the 6th Corps, the American spearhead of the invasion, and he was no flatterer and no soft touch. He was a hard, profane, brilliant field general. And he came to regard Patch with something close to reverence. He would later write that Patch was a man of outstanding integrity, a courageous and competent leader, and an unselfish comrade in arms. That was the partnership. Patch would pick the right men, trust them completely, and then get out of their way. No theatrical visits staged for photographers. No rehearsed catchphrases. Just professionals given room to fight. Together they built the plan. Truscott's 6th Corps would hit the beaches of the Riviera with 3 battle-hardened divisions, the 3rd, the 36th, and the 45th Veterans of Italy, who knew exactly how ugly an amphibious assault could get. Behind them would come powerful French forces under General de Lattre de Tassigny, men burning to liberate their own soil. The naval and air bombardment would be overwhelming. The airborne drop would seize the high ground behind the beaches before dawn. It was meticulous, it was rehearsed, and it had exactly one chance to go right on one morning against a coastline the Germans had spent years fortifying. The date was set, August 15th, 1944. And if the beaches ran red, the way Omaha had, the doubters would be proven right and Patch would be finished. The morning came gray and tense over the Mediterranean. Offshore, a vast fleet blackened the water. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, hundreds of hulls stretching to the horizon. On the decks, men from Texas and Oklahoma and the mountains of Colorado checked their weapons in the dark and said nothing. In the command ship, Patch watched the coast of France emerge from the haze, the fragile lungs pulling at the salt air, and waited to learn whether his army would live or die on those beaches. Then the naval guns opened up. The bombardment was a wall of thunder that shook the sea itself. Shells screamed into the German coastal batteries, throwing up geysers of fire and stone. Waves of aircraft came in low, hammering the defenses, blasting the wire in the bunkers. And behind that curtain of destruction, the landing craft dropped their ramps and the first men waded ashore. And then something happened that almost nobody expected. The beaches were quiet, not silent, but nothing like the horror of Normandy. The overwhelming bombardment, the airborne troops seizing the heights, the second-rate quality of many of the German defenders in the south, all of it came together in a single stunning result. Men who had braced for a slaughter walked up the sand and found the enemy stunned, scattered, or already surrendering. Truscott's divisions pushed inland almost immediately, faster than the most optimistic planner had dared to hope. The high ground fell. The beachhead held. The trap was springing exactly as Patch had drawn it. By the end of that first day, the numbers told a story so lopsided it barely seemed real. Roughly 94,000 men had gone ashore. And the cost, the terrible price everyone had feared, was fewer than 400 casualties. Let that land for a moment. The bloodiest fear of the entire operation, and Patch had put an army on a hostile coast for a fraction of what a single bad hour at Normandy had cost. It was, in terms of price paid for ground, taken the most successful major amphibious assault of the entire war. Not Normandy. Not the celebrated landings everyone remembers. This one. The one commanded by the man nobody can name. The doubt evaporated. The skeptics fell silent. Eisenhower himself would later say that no development of that summer of 1944 added more decisively to the Allied advantage than the attack coming up from the south. The Supreme Commander, the same man whose politics would later bury Patch, called it one of the most decisive strokes of the year. In a single morning, the quiet general had turned a plan Churchill called a blunder into a triumph the Supreme Commander could not deny. But a successful landing was only the beginning. Getting ashore cheaply meant nothing if the enemy escaped to fight another day. And here Patch did what almost no Allied commander managed in 1944. He moved fast. The German Army Group G in southern France numbered something like 210,000 men, and they were now in mortal danger of being cut off entirely by the landings behind them. A cautious general would have consolidated built-up supplies, advanced by careful stages. Patch did the opposite. He unleashed his army up the Rhone Valley in a headlong pursuit, refusing to let the Germans catch their breath. Truscott drove his corps forward at a punishing pace, spearheads racing ahead, cutting roads, closing traps, herding entire German columns into destruction. The pace was relentless, and the results were staggering. By the second week of September, Patch's forward elements linked hands with Patton's Third Army sweeping in from Normandy near Dijon, sealing off the whole south of France in a single vast pocket. And the haul of prisoners was almost beyond belief. During that pursuit up the Rhone, the 7th Army captured more than 88,000 Germans of Army Group G. Think about that number against the famous ones. The celebrated victory at Falaise, the one that fills the history books, netted a comparable bag of prisoners. Patch's pursuit rivaled it, and in some accountings exceeded it. But you have heard of Falaise. You have almost certainly never heard of the Rhone pursuit. That right there is the pattern of this man's entire career in a single comparison. The Germans in the south were reeling, bewildered, hemorrhaging men and equipment. Whole units simply ceased to exist as fighting formations. From the enemy's side, it looked like a catastrophe unfolding faster than they could react. The general they had never worried about, the one no intelligence briefing had flagged as a threat, was tearing the bottom out of their entire position in France. By the middle of September, the 7th Army had advanced hundreds of miles from the beaches. Patch had landed at the lowest cost of any major operation of the war, and then conducted one of the fastest and most decisive pursuits of the entire campaign in the West. On paper, it was a masterpiece. By any honest measure of generalship, the man had just delivered one of the finest Army-level performances of 1944. And then he reached the German frontier. And the easy ground ran out, because ahead of the 7th Army rose the Vosges Mountains. Steep forested ridges marching one behind another, wreathed in freezing rain and the first snows of a brutal winter. Every road became a defile the Germans could block. Every hilltop became its own fortress. There was no open tank country here, no dash across France, no columns racing down highways. This would be a soldier's fight, won by infantry, climbing through wet timber, a single ridge at a time in the cold, against a German army that had stopped running and turned to make a stand on ground that heavily favored the defender. And here is a claim that stops military historians cold. In all of recorded military history, no attacking army had ever successfully forced its way through the high Vosges. Not the Romans, not the armies of 1,000 years of European wars. No one. The mountains had defeated every attacker who ever tried. Patch was about to march his men straight into terrain that had never in history been conquered from the front. That fight is where Part 3 will take us, and it will test everything about the man. Because as Patch pushed his army into those frozen mountains, 3 things were closing in on him at once, and any one of them could have broken a lesser commander. The first was the enemy digging into the most defensible ground in Western Europe, determined to make the Americans pay for every yard in blood and snow. The second was the poison from above. The 6th Army Group under Jacob Devers was about to reach the Rhine, and Devers would spot a chance to cross it. A bold stroke that might have torn open the entire German defense of the West, months before the famous crossing at Remagen. And Eisenhower, the man who did not trust Devers, would say no. The boldest opportunity on the entire Western Front that autumn would be sitting in Patch's sector, and it would be vetoed for reasons that had as much to do with personalities at headquarters as with the war on the ground. And the third thing, closing in on Alexander Patch, was personal, and it was the heaviest of all. Somewhere in the frozen hills of eastern France, in the fighting near a place called the Forest of Parroy, his only son was leading a company of American infantry against entrenched German guns. A West Point man, 3rd generation, the boy who carried the family's whole legacy. And the war was about to take him. The German army was massing for one last great gamble in the West. The Vosges were waiting unconquered by any army in history. And a father was about to receive the news that no medal in the world could ever answer for. The real war for Alexander Patch was only beginning. In Part 1, an overlooked general named Alexander Patch ground out the first American ground victory of the Pacific War on Guadalcanal. In Part 2, he landed an entire field army on the French Riviera at the lowest cost of any major amphibious assault of the war, then raced up the Rhone Valley and bagged more than 88,000 German prisoners. But then his army reached the German frontier, and the easy ground ended. Ahead rose the high Vosges Mountains that no attacking army in recorded history had ever conquered from the front. And now the Germans had stopped running. They dug into the ridges, determined to make the Americans bleed for every frozen yard. Winter was coming down hard, ammunition ran short, and the German command, which had never once feared the quiet general, was about to learn what he could do in the worst terrain in Western Europe. This was no longer a pursuit. This was a knife fight in the snow. By October 1944, the German High Command understood the threat in the south was no longer a broken, fleeing army group. It was a disciplined machine climbing straight toward the Reich's own border. German intelligence pieced together the shape of it. The 7th Army was not stopping to lick its wounds. It was pressing into the Vosges, into ground the German staff considered impassable to any determined attacker. The German response was to fortify everything. They believed the mountains themselves were a weapon. Steep ridges, dense forest, a single road winding through each valley, easy to block, easy to defend. They positioned machine gun nests to cover every approach. They registered their artillery on every clearing. They flooded the low ground and mined the trails. The German commanders were confident. History was on their side. Nobody had ever forced these heights, and they intended to keep that record intact while they bled the Americans white. And the losses they inflicted were real. The fighting in the Vosges was some of the ugliest of the entire war in the West. Cold that froze weapons and split boots. Rain that turned to sleet, then snow. Trench foot ran through the ranks. Men climbed slick ridges under fire, took a hilltop, and found another ridge waiting behind it. The 36th Division, the 3rd, the 45th, the veterans of the Riviera now clawed forward yard by yard through timber that swallowed whole platoons. But here is what the German command failed to understand about Alexander Patch. He fought the way he had always fought, methodically, patiently. He did not throw men at those ridges in reckless frontal waves to buy speed he did not need. He used artillery. He used maneuver. He sent infantry around the flanks through terrain the Germans thought no one could cross. And the casualty math began to turn against the defenders. Consider the number that defines Patch as a battlefield commander. During that autumn offensive in the mountains in winter on the attack, the 7th Army inflicted more than 24%, more casualties on the Germans than it suffered itself. Read that again. An attacking army in the worst terrain in Europe, in the worst weather of the war, was hurting the defender worse than the defender hurt it. That is nearly unheard of in military history. The rule is that the attacker pays more. Patch broke the rule. The German losses mounted. Prisoners flowed to the rear in growing streams. Units that had been ordered to hold the passes at all costs found themselves outflanked, cut off, and destroyed. The confidence began to crack. The mountains that were supposed to stop the Americans were not stopping them. But the enemy in front was not the only threat closing in on Patch. Because as his army fought toward the Rhine, a second battle opened up behind him. And it was fought not against Germans, but against the politics of his own high command. When the 7th Army and the 6th Army Group reached the Rhine near Strasbourg in late November, Jacob Devers saw the opportunity of the entire campaign. His men had located a feasible crossing site near Rastatt. The Germans in front of him were reeling. A bridgehead across the Rhine in late 1944, months before the famous capture of the bridge at Remagen, might have torn the entire German defense of the West wide open. Devers wanted to cross at once, and Eisenhower said no. The Supreme Commander ordered Devers to turn north and clear the West Bank instead. The chance was gone. Historians have argued about that decision ever since. Some defend the caution. Others see it as a moment where Eisenhower's documented distrust of Devers cost the Allies a genuine opportunity. And here is the bitter part for our story. The army that would have made that crossing was Patch's. The boldest stroke available on the entire Western Front that autumn was sitting in his sector, and it was vetoed for reasons that had as much to do with personalities at headquarters as with the war on the ground. The competence of the men on the ground did not get a vote. When the politics at the top decided what Patch's army was allowed to attempt, the decision was made over his head. But no political veto could take away what his men were about to do at Strasbourg. Then came one of the great moments of the entire war, and almost nobody outside France remembers it. Picture the Saverne Gap. A pass through the mountains, the gateway to the Alsatian plain, and the city of Strasbourg beyond. Strasbourg, the capital of Alsace, under the German flag since the fall of France in 1940. A symbol. A wound in the French soul. Patch turned loose the French 2nd Armored Division under General Jacques Leclerc, the same division that had liberated Paris. And on November 23, 1944, Leclerc's tanks burst through the Saverne Gap and drove straight for the city. The attack was fast. It was violent. It was total. Leclerc split his columns and sent them racing along multiple roads, slicing past German strongpoints, refusing to slow down. The German defenders were caught off balance. Some were still eating breakfast when French tanks appeared in their rear. The tanks rolled into Strasbourg. Machine guns hammered. German positions collapsed. Panic spread through the garrison. Men who had held the city for 4 years scrambled to escape or surrender. And above the ancient cathedral, the tricolor of France rose again. Years earlier, in the burning sands of the Libyan desert, Leclerc's Frenchmen had sworn an oath, the oath of Kufra. They swore they would not rest until their own flag flew again over Strasbourg Cathedral. They had carried that oath across 2 continents and thousands of miles of war. And on that November day under Patch's command, they kept it. The strategic result was enormous. The 7th Army had reached the Rhine. A German defensive line built to hold the mountains through the winter had been shattered in a matter of days. Thousands of German soldiers were captured. Thousands more were killed or scattered. An entire sector of the German front in Alsace had been ripped open. And Patch had done what no attacking army in recorded history had ever done. He had forced the high Vosges. One American soldier who fought through those mountains later remembered the shock of coming down out of the frozen timber and seeing the Rhine Valley open below them, the great river of Germany finally in sight. They had climbed through hell. They had done the impossible. And most of them never knew the name of the quiet general who had planned it. The news of Strasbourg raced across the Allied world, and its meaning was impossible to miss. The impact rippled outward, far beyond one city. The liberation of Strasbourg was one of the most emotionally charged moments of the entire war for France. It electrified the French people. It proved that the tide had turned in the south as decisively as it had in the north. And it cemented something the Germans could no longer deny. The southern front, the one they had dismissed, the one Churchill had called a mistake, had become a hammer. For the German command, the strategic picture was now a catastrophe. In a matter of months, an army group they had barely tracked had landed in the south, destroyed the bottom of their line in France, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, forced the unforceable mountains, and reached the Rhine. Their entire defensive strategy in the west was crumbling on 2 fronts at once, and the numbers told the whole story of what Patch's 7th Army had achieved. Since the beaches of the Riviera, it had advanced hundreds of miles. It had captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. It had inflicted casualties at a rate that punished the enemy worse than itself, even on the attack, even in the mountains, even in winter. It had liberated the great city of Alsace. By any honest measure of generalship, this was one of the finest army-level campaigns of the entire war in Europe. The Allied High Command knew it. In private, Eisenhower would rank Patch around 9th among more than 30 of his senior generals, ahead of famous army commanders, whose names are far better remembered today ahead, even of Patch's own boss Devers. The men at the very top understood exactly how good he was. They simply never told the public. His soldiers understood, too. They had followed this soft-spoken man through jungle and mountain across 2 oceans, and they trusted him completely. A senior staff officer said that Patch cared for his soldiers more than any commander he had ever known, and then said simply, "I love that man." Lucien Truscott called him a man of outstanding integrity, a courageous and competent leader, an unselfish comrade in arms. These were not the words men used about a forgettable general. The recognition, such as it was, came in flashes. His face on the cover of Time magazine in the glow of the southern France triumph. The private rankings that placed him among the very best. But Patch never reached for any of it. When the Time cover ran, he did not even bother to read the story about himself. He wrote to his wife that the notoriety would soon die out, and he was right. He made sure of it. The German army was reeling. The Rhine was in sight. The impossible mountains were behind him. On the map in the winter of 1944, Alexander Patch stood at the peak of his career, the commander of a victorious army poised on the edge of the Reich itself. But the war was not finished with him, and neither was fate. Because as his army crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany in the spring of 1945 toward Nuremberg, toward Munich, toward Hitler's own mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, Two things were waiting that no victory could soften. The first was already behind him, a grave in the frozen earth of eastern France. A loss so personal that the general carried it in silence to the end of his days. The second was still ahead, waiting in a Texas hospital only months after the guns fell silent. The man who conquered two theaters of war on opposite sides of the planet was about to become one of the most forgotten generals America ever produced. And the reasons why are the strangest, saddest chapter of the entire story. This story has one final chapter, and it is one that almost no one knows. Across 3 parts, we followed the strangest command record of the entire war. An overlooked officer ranked near the bottom of his West Point class with lungs ruined by pneumonia took the first American ground victory of the Pacific on Guadalcanal. Then he crossed the planet, landed an army on the French Riviera at the lowest cost of any major amphibious assault of the war-forced mountains no attacker in history had ever conquered, and liberated Strasbourg. On the map in the spring of 1945, Alexander Patch stood at the peak of his career. But we ended with a question. What happened to the man behind all of it? Here is the twist. Almost nobody knows. Because this is not a story about a general who won everything and then collected his reward. This is a story about a man who won everything and then vanished from memory almost completely. And the reasons why are stranger and sadder than any battle he ever fought. Because sometimes victory comes with a price that no medal can ever repay. The spring of 1945 should have been Patch's coronation. In March, his 7th Army launched Operation Undertone and crossed the Rhine near Worms. From there, the advance became a flood. Aschaffenburg fell after a fanatical defense, then Würzburg, then Bamberg, and then the symbolic prizes began to fall one after another. On April 20th, 1945, after days of house-to-house fighting, the 7th Army captured Nuremberg, the city of the Nazi Party rallies, the place whose very name had become shorthand for the regime itself. There was something fitting about the quiet, anonymous army being the one to seize the stage where Hitler had once performed his power. On April 30th, the day Hitler killed himself in Berlin, Patch's men took Munich, the birthplace of the entire Nazi movement. And in the first days of May, his soldiers captured Berchtesgaden itself, the mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps where Hitler had built his eagle's nest. Patch's men had walked all the way from the beaches of the Riviera to the dictator's own back porch. But 6 days before Munich fell, his army did something heavier than any conquest. On April 29, 1945, soldiers of the 7th Army reached the gates of the concentration camp at Dachau. What they found there, the boxcars of the dead, the survivors who were barely still alive, became one of the things that generation carried in silence for the rest of their lives. The army that walked from the Riviera to Dachau to the dictator's mountain was commanded by a man whose name almost no one can recall today. And here is the wound underneath all of it, the loss the general carried through every one of those victories. Because Patch had a son. His only son. Captain Alexander McCarroll. Patch III called Mac a West Point man, just like his father and his grandfather before him. 3 generations of West Point. Mac commanded a company in the 79th Infantry Division, fighting in the same theater under the same army group, a short distance from his father's headquarters. In late August 1944, Mac was shot in the shoulder, leading an attack, and he kept leading it for 2 more hours before he would let anyone treat him. Then, on October 22, 1944, in the fighting near the forest of Perroy, Captain Mac Patch was killed in action, leading his men against entrenched German guns. He was 23 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart. The father buried his only son at the Epinal American Cemetery in France. And then he got back in his vehicle, returned to his headquarters, and went on commanding 200,000 other men's sons through the worst winter of the war. The army does not stop for one man's grief, not even a general's. Whatever he felt, he carried it in private in letters to his wife that historians would only read decades later. To bury your only child and then walk back into the command post and pick up the map again. There is a kind of strength there that has no medal, and it is the truest measure of the man, more than Guadalcanal, more than Strasbourg, more than any of it. But his real legacy was never going to be found in medals or captured cities. Because the cruelest turn of the whole story was still to come, and it was not the enemy that delivered it. Alexander Patch did not get to grow old and tell his story. He did not get to write the memoir that every famous general wrote, the book that shaped how history would remember its author. The pneumonia he first caught in the cold of France in 1918, the disease that had stalked him through New Caledonia and Guadalcanal, that had shadowed every campaign of his life, finally caught up with him. On November 21, 1945, just 2 days short of his 56th birthday, only about 6 months after the war in Europe ended, Alexander Patch died of pneumonia at a hospital at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. He was buried at West Point. Think about what that timing did to his legacy. Patton died that same December. But Patton had already become a legend, already built his myth, already lived in the public imagination. Patch died before the public ever learned who he was. He left no memoir. He left no carefully managed reputation. He left a widow who had now lost both a son and a husband to the same war within 13 months of each other. And so the machinery of memory ran right past him. When Eisenhower wrote his official post-war report, about 180 pages summarizing the campaign in the West, he gave Patch's entire 7th Army just 8 pages. 8 pages for an army that had invaded southern France, forced the Vosges, and taken Nuremberg, Munich, and Berchtesgaden. Historians have called it exactly what it was, an obvious snub tied directly to Eisenhower's documented dislike of Jacob Devers, the boss Patch served under. The politics at the top settled downward and dimmed the reputation of the general who deserved it least. Here is the detail that tells you everything about who Patch was. When the campaign credits were assigned, his men, the soldiers who had defeated the last German offensive in Alsace, were initially folded into the credit for the Battle of the Bulge, a fight they had not even been in. Patch went over Eisenhower's head directly to Marshall and demanded that his soldiers receive the credit they had actually earned. And he won. The record was officially changed. But by the time the change became official, most of those soldiers had already gone home. He spent his own dwindling influence not on his own fame, but on a battle streamer for men who would mostly never know he had fought for it. That is the pattern that echoes far beyond one war. Because the story of Alexander Patch is the clearest case there is of an uncomfortable truth about every institution. The skills that make a person excellent at the actual job are not the same skills that make them famous for it. And institutions reward the second set far more reliably than the first. Patch was superb at the work. He built divisions from nothing. He won campaigns on 2 oceans. He kept his soldiers alive at a better rate than almost any peer. And he handed the credit to everyone but himself. The Army's machinery of memory, the reports, the press, the memoirs, the rankings that get leaked, and the rankings that stay buried, ran right past him because he refused to feed it. Consider how the famous reputations were actually built. After the war, the memoirs came one after another. Eisenhower wrote Crusade in Europe. Bradley wrote A Soldier's Story. Montgomery wrote his memoirs. Patton's writings were published as War as I Knew It. Mark Clark, the publicity-hungry man Patch had replaced, wrote Calculated Risk. Each of those books put its author at the dead center of the story. Popular history leans on those first-hand accounts because they are vivid and because they are there on the shelf. So ask a simple question. Where is the Patch memoir? There is none. He died before the memoir era even began. When historians sat down to write the war, the seat where his own voice should have been was simply empty, and the story flowed around the gap as if he had never been there. It was not a conspiracy. Nobody sat in a room and decided to erase Alexander Patch. It was worse than that. It was the ordinary working of a system that quietly confuses being known with being good. The system did not hate Patch. It just had no slot for a man who did the work and then went silent. If that pattern sounds familiar, if you have ever watched the person who quietly does the work get passed over while the person who works the room collects the promotion, then you already understand Patch better than the history books ever let on. And there is one final detail that most people never learn. Look closer at the private judgments of the men at the very top. The assessments never meant for the public. In February 1945, Eisenhower compiled a ranking of his senior generals recorded in his naval aide's diary. On that list, Patch sat around ninth among more than 30 of the most senior commanders in the theater, ahead of Courtney Hodges of the First Army, ahead of William Simpson of the Ninth, two men whose names you are far more likely to recognize than his. And critically, Patch was ranked well ahead of his own boss Devers. So the truth is almost unbelievable. The senior leadership of the United States Army and private rated Patch above generals who became household names. They knew exactly how good he was. They simply never told the public, and the public never had a reason to learn. The evidence of his greatness existed the entire time. It was just locked inside a diary, while the memoirs of louder men filled the shelves, and his name did not vanish completely. It survives in places most people never think to look. A Navy troop ship was named for him, and it carried American soldiers across the Atlantic for years. And the headquarters of United States European Command in Stuttgart, the nerve center of American military power on the European continent for generations, sits on a post called Patch Barracks. The command that has anchored the Western Alliance since the Cold War bears his name. And most of the soldiers who report there every morning could not tell you one true thing about the man on the sign. He is remembered exactly the way he lived. Present essential and almost completely invisible. So here is the whole story in a handful of sentences. From an overlooked officer ranked near the bottom of his class with ruined lungs and a bag of rolling tobacco came the only American general to win a Pacific Island campaign and then command a field army across Europe. He took Guadalcanal and Berchtesgaden both. He landed 94,000 men for fewer than 400 casualties, bagged 88,000 prisoners in a single pursuit, Vosges Mountains. No army in history had ever forced and inflicted more punishment than he took even on the attack in winter. He proved that the finest work is often done by the people least interested in being seen doing it. And in return, a father who buried his only son in French soil and then died of the lungs the First War had ruined before the Second War's dust had even settled, received 8 pages and a name almost no one can recall. Alexander Patch did not lose the argument over his own legacy. He never got to make it. Remember the name now, because the men who served under him never forgot it, and neither should we.